I remember the exact sound the glass door made when it didn't open for me. Not a slam, worse than a slam. A soft, electronic click. The kind of click that means someone on the other side just decided you don't exist. I was standing outside Chateau Noir, the most exclusive boutique in the entire Meridian Grand Mall, wearing sneakers that cost less than the doorknob I was reaching for. And a security guard the size of a refrigerator put his palm flat against the glass. Not aggressive. Almost polite, like he was doing a favor. "Can I help you find something out?" he said, and he smiled when he said it. That's the part that still sits in my chest like a stone. He smiled. I want you to feel this moment the way I felt it, because everything that came after, every single thing, was built on the foundation of that smile. My palms were sweating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, that thick underwater thud thud thud. The air conditioning inside that store was so cold you could see it. This faint shimmer over the marble floor, and the perfume drifting out through the cracked door smelled like money, like white flowers, and old leather, and something floral I couldn't name. I could see the shelves, rows of handbags lit like museum pieces, each one under its own private spotlight, like it deserved worship. And there I was, on the outside, looking in through glass that suddenly felt like the thickest wall in the world. Before I go further, let me set the whole scene properly, because I need you standing exactly where I was standing. The Meridian Grand isn't just a mall. It's 5 stories of curated silence, the kind of silence that costs money to manufacture. No muzak, no echo. Somebody had engineered the acoustics so that even footsteps sounded expensive. Skylights 3 stories up, let in this soft filtered gold light that made everyone underneath it look like they were being lit for a photograph they didn't know was being taken. Fountains in the atrium ran so quietly, you had to strain to hear the water at all. It was a building designed, floor to ceiling. Tunzu, remind you of exactly where you stood, in the order of things the second you walked through the door. And I had walked through that door, in old sneakers, a plain jacket, jeans with a small tear near the knee I hadn't bothered to fix, because fixing it had simply never made it to the top of my list of problems that month. Except that month, ironically, I could have bought the tailor's whole shop and the block it sat on. I'm here to shop, I told him, calm, measured. I'd learned a long time ago that the moment you raise your voice, are you lost? He tilted his head. Like I'd told a joke he was deciding whether to laugh at. This is a high-end store, sir. Everything here starts at 4 figures. And I will never forget this sentence as long as I live. He leaned in, dropped his voice like he was doing me some kind of mercy, and said, "Get out, you're ruining the vibe." Ruining the vibe. 4 words. That's all it takes sometimes to rewrite a person's entire nervous system. I felt my face go hot, then cold, then numb. Somewhere behind him, through the glass, I saw 2 sales associates glance over, whisper something to each other, and go back to refolding a cashmere scarf that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Nobody came to correct him. Nobody said, "Sir, let the gentleman in." The whole store, the whole gleaming, cold, beautiful store, just watched a man get erased in real time and decided it was fine. Decided it was, in fact, the vibe. I want to tell you something strange that happened in my body in that exact second, because I think it matters. Time didn't slow down the way people describe in movies. It sped up. My mind started running calculations, instinctively, automatically, the way it always does when I'm cornered. Square footage, foot traffic patterns, lease renewal date, all of it flooding in uninvited. Because some broken part of my brain processes humiliation the same way it processes a hostile boardroom. I was doing math in my head while a security guard told me I didn't belong somewhere. I had just legally purchased that morning. That's not composure. That's a coping mechanism I built when I was still too young to know the difference. Here's what he didn't know. Here's the thing sitting in my jacket pocket that whole time, folded up tight against my ribs like a second heartbeat. A manila envelope with a wire transfer confirmation inside it, dated that morning, for the acquisition of the Meridian Grand Property Holdings Group. Every store, every lease, every square inch of marble under his shiny black shoes. Mine. As of 9:47 that morning, mine. I hadn't planned to come in sneakers. I hadn't planned to come in at all, honestly. My lawyer told me the closing was purely paperwork, that I didn't need to set foot in the building until the press release went out next week. But something in me needed to see it first, needed to walk through it as a nobody. I wanted, and this is the part that's hard to admit, I wanted to know what it felt like from the bottom, one last time, before I was never allowed to feel it again. There's a reason I wanted that, and it took me years of therapy. Yes, therapy, the kind that billionaires are supposed to be too busy for, to fully understand it. When you spend your whole childhood being made to feel small, some part of you never fully believes the smallness is gone, no matter how many zeros accumulate in your bank account. Some part of you keeps checking, keeps testing the door to see if it's really unlocked now or if it just looks unlocked. I walked into that mall that morning not as a power move but as a test. And the door told me exactly what I was afraid it would tell me. It told me nothing had changed. Not really. Not underneath. I didn't know I'd get an answer this fast. I didn't know the answer would have a face, a name tag that said Derek, and a smile that I would think about every single night for the next 3 weeks. Let me back up because you need to understand why this moment did what it did to me. Why 4 words from a stranger nearly put me on my knees on that cold marble floor. 19 years ago, I was 11 years old, and I was standing outside a different set of glass doors. A grocery store, not a boutique, but the principle doesn't change with inflation. My mother had $43 in food stamps and a coupon book held together with a rubber band, and a woman in a blazer, some kind of manager, stopped us at the entrance and asked, loud enough for the whole parking lot to hear, whether we were actually going to be buying something today, or just browsing. I remember my mother's hand tightening around mine. I remember the specific shame of it, hot prickling crawling up the back of my neck into my scalp. I remember promising myself, in the particular dramatic way only an 11-year-old can promise something, that one day I would own every single store that ever looked at us like that. But I haven't told you the part that came after, the part I've never said out loud to anyone outside of a therapist's office. My mother didn't argue with that woman. She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand an apology, didn't even really react on the outside at all. She just said very quietly, "Yes, ma'am, we're buying groceries," and walked us both inside, and filled the cart carefully, methodically, item by item, checking prices against a mental math I could see happening behind her eyes. And when we got to the register, she was $7 short. $7. I watched her put back a small box of cereal. My cereal, one with the cartoon tiger on it, without a word, without even looking at me. Like it cost her something just to do it in front of a line of strangers. That's the image that lives behind my eyes every single time someone tries to make me feel small, not the manager's voice. My mother's hands quietly putting a box of cereal back on a conveyor belt so we wouldn't hold up the line. I didn't become a billionaire out of ambition. People love that story. The hungry kid who claws his way up because he dreamed big. That's not what happened to me. I became what I became out of memory. Every acquisition, every deal, every sleepless night building spreadsheets by the light of a laptop that was older than some of my employees. All of it was fueled by that one sentence a sister manager said to my mother when I was 11. Are you actually going to be buying something today? So when Derek said, "Get out, you're ruining the vibe," he didn't just insult a stranger in sneakers. He reopened a door I'd spent 19 years trying to keep shut. And for one long silent second, standing on that marble threshold, I was both people at once. The 11-year-old boy holding his mother's hand, and the man who now legally owned the ground Derek was standing on. 2 versions of me, separated by 2 decades and about $11 billion occupying the exact same boss. I didn't say any of that to him, of course. I just nodded slowly, the way you nod when you're filing something away for later. And trust me, I was filing it away, and I said, "You're right. I probably don't belong in there." And I turned and walked away. You should have seen his face relax. That's the detail that haunts me the most, actually, not the insult itself, but the relief on his face when I left without a fight. Like he'd successfully done his job. Like keeping people like me out was the job. I want to tell you I made him sweat right there on the spot. Pulled out the paperwork and watched his face collapse in real time. That would make a better story, wouldn't it? Instant justice, cinematic and clean. But real justice, the kind that actually changes something, takes longer than 60 seconds of satisfaction. I walked to the parking garage, sat in my car, and I called my lawyer, and I said 4 words back into the phone that mirrored his exactly, except mine were a promise instead of an insult. "Move up the announcement." He asked me if I was sure. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my life. But before I called my lawyer, I sat in that car for almost a full minute without moving, without even putting the key in the ignition. And I let myself feel something I don't usually let myself feel in public, or in private, honestly. I let myself cry, not loud dramatic. Just a slow leak, the kind that surprises you more than it relieves you, tears sliding down while my face stayed almost perfectly still. Like my body hadn't gotten the memo that I was supposed to be calm. $11 billion and a man in a blazer with a name tag had just made me feel exactly as small as I'd felt at 11 years old. That's the part nobody tells you about revenge stories. The money doesn't inoculate you. It just gives you better tools to respond with once the feeling passes. Because here's what nobody in that boutique understood as they watched a man in sneakers walk away with his head down. I wasn't leaving in defeat. I was leaving to go get the paperwork that would let me come back and never have to leave again. And when I came back, it wasn't going to be through that glass door. It was going to be through the front entrance of the entire building, with a security detail of my own, a legal team, and a folder full of names. Every employee, every manager, every tenant contract in that mall. Because when you buy a building, you don't just buy the marble and the light fixtures. You buy the power to decide who gets to belong inside it. Derek didn't know that yet. Nobody in that store knew it yet. For the next several hours, they would go on folding scarves and adjusting spotlights and smiling at customers with the right shoes, completely unaware that the clock on their entire way of operating had just started ticking down from 60 minutes. I sat in that parking garage for 11 minutes. I counted, because counting kept my hands from shaking, and I watched the elevator doors of Meridian Grand open and close, ferrying people in cashmere and people in uniforms, none of them knowing that in less than an hour, I was going to walk back through those doors as something entirely different. Not a shopper, nobody, the owner. And there was one more thing sitting in the back of my mind during those 11 minutes. Something I hadn't planned for. Something that was about to complicate everything I thought I understood about this moment. A phone call I still needed to make, to someone I hadn't since spoken to in almost 19 years. Someone whose name was on the very same acquisition paperwork sitting in my jacket pocket, in a place I never expected to see it again. Derek was about to find out exactly what ruining the vibe really meant. But so was I. My assistant called back within 4 minutes. That's how fast the machine moves when you've spent 2 decades building it. The press release wasn't due for another week, but ownership had already changed hands that morning. All we were doing now was choosing when the world found out. I told him to make it now, not Monday. Now. I wanted Derek to hear it from my own mouth, not from a headline scrolling across his phone on his lunch break. But before I gave that order, I made the other call. The one I said I'd get back to. 19 years is a long time to not say someone's name out loud. Her name was Marlene. She was the store manager who stopped me and my mother at that grocery store door when I was 11. The one who asked, loud enough for the parking lot to hear, whether we were actually going to be buying something today. I hadn't thought about her specifically in years. I'd folded her into a symbol, a stand-in for every gatekeeper who ever decided who deserved dignity and who didn't. I never expected to see her name again. And yet there it was 3 weeks earlier, buried in the due diligence paperwork for an unrelated acquisition, a small property management firm my team was folding into a larger portfolio. Marlene Whitfield, Regional Operations Director, the exact same woman 2 decades older, now overseeing a chain of retail leases that, as of that morning, also technically belonged to me. I want to be honest about what I felt when my legal team flagged the name and asked if it was a conflict of interest worth addressing. I felt something ugly rise up in me, fast, hot, almost joyful in a way that scared me a little. Here was a second door, a second chance, a second grocery store manager standing on the other side of glass I now owned. Some part of me, the 11-year-old part, wanted to burn her position to the ground, on principle alone, wanted a symmetry so clean it would feel like closing a wound with a single stitch. I sat with that feeling in the parking garage for a long moment, right after wiping my face, right before I called my lawyer about Derek, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I didn't fire Marlene, I called her. She answered on the third ring, professional, a little guarded, the voice of someone used to fielding calls from people much higher up the food chain than she was used to speaking with directly. I told her who I was. I heard the silence stretch out on her end, the particular silence of someone doing frantic math about whether this call was going to end her career. And then I asked her a question I'd been carrying around, unspoken, for 19 years. Did she remember a woman with a coupon book and a little boy at a grocery store, telling them they didn't look like they belonged? The silence that followed was different this time, longer, heavier, and then she said something I did not expect. She said she remembered, not the specific incident, she couldn't have, there'd been too many years and too many customers in between, but the practice. She told me, voice shaking slightly, that she'd been trained to do exactly that her regional manager back then had literally coached staff to profile for loiterers, that this was store policy dressed up as loss prevention, that she'd hated saying those words to people even then but was told her job depended on saying them, that she had a toddler at home and a rent payment due, and she did what people do when the choice is between somebody else's dignity and their own child's dinner. I'm not telling you this to excuse her. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to let myself off the hook by making her into a sympathetic victim of the system and calling it closed. That's too easy. She still said the words. She still watched my mother put a box of cereal back on the belt without offering so much as an apology. People make choices inside broken systems, and the system doesn't absolve the choice. But something in her voice, something in the exhaustion behind it, cracked open a door in my chest I didn't know was still bolted shut. I'd spent 19 years imagining Marlene as a villain in a fixed frame, frozen at the worst 5 seconds of her life, the way we do with everyone who hurts us. I never once imagined her going home that night, tired, putting her own kid to bed, maybe hating the version of herself the job required her to be. I told her I wasn't calling to fire her. I told her I was calling to ask her one question. If she had the power, real power, the kind I now had, to rewrite the policy that made her say those words in the first place, would she do it? She didn't hesitate, she said yes, immediately. Like she'd been waiting 19 years for someone to ask. I made her a proposal on that call, one my legal team would spend the rest of the day scrambling to formalize. She would help me design and implement the same kind of dignity-first retail policy I was about to roll out at Meridian Grand, across every property in our expanding portfolio. Not as some symbolic redemption arc for my benefit, as an actual job with actual accountability, because the woman had 19 years of retail operations experience, and knew exactly which levers got pulled to create a culture like the one that humiliated my mother. Which meant she also knew exactly which levers to pull to dismantle it. I share this with you not to make Marlene the hero of the story, and not even really to make myself the hero of the story either. I share it because it's the detail that changed how I walked back into Meridian Grand that afternoon. I wasn't walking back in purely as a man's seeking a clean, symmetrical revenge against Derek. I was walking back in as someone who'd just spent 20 minutes on the phone learning that even the villains in our origin stories are usually just frightened people following orders, and that real change doesn't come from punishing individuals. It comes from rebuilding the machine that manufactures people like that in the first place. That's the frame I carried with me through the front doors of Meridian Grand. Glass 3 stories tall, flanked by a legal team and 2 members of the property management company, already scrambling to catch up with a change of ownership none of them had time to process. I felt something shift in the air itself the moment I crossed the threshold. People noticed, not because they recognized my face, because they recognized the formation around me. Suits don't move like that for nobody. Suits move like that for power. Derek was still at his post, still cold-eyed, still scanning the crowd for anyone who didn't fit his idea of who deserved to be there. I watched him clock the group, walking toward Chateau Noir, watched his posture straighten instinctively, some old animal wiring in men like him that responds to authority even before the brain catches up. And then I watched the exact second he recognized me. His face did 3 things in under 2 seconds. Confusion, then a flicker of amusement, like he thought I'd come back to argue, maybe make a scene, maybe cry a little so he could tell his coworkers about it later. And then the third thing. When the store's general manager came jogging out from the back office, pale as paper, and said my name out loud, followed by the words "the new owner," his face did something I have never seen a human face do before or since. It didn't just fall, emptied. I let the silence sit there for a second. I'd earned that second. The whole atrium seemed to hold its breath with me. The fountains still running their quiet water. The golden light still falling through the skies. Indifferent to the fact that a man's entire understanding of his place in the world was collapsing in real time 6 feet in front of me. Then I said quietly, the way you talk to someone when you actually want them to hear you and not just feel scolded. I'm not here to fire you on the spot, Derek. I'm not that guy. I'm here because I want you to understand something and I need you to really hear it, not just survive it. His mouth opened, nothing came out. I kept going. An hour ago, you looked at me and decided I didn't belong somewhere I already owned. That's not really about me though. That's about a policy, a culture, something this building has been teaching its employees for years. That worth can be judged by a pair of shoes. That hospitality is a reward for looking rich instead of a baseline for being human. I'm not angry at you specifically. I'm angry that you were trained to be a wall instead of a door. I could see him searching my face for the trap, for the moment the mercy would flip into punishment. I understood that instinct completely. It's the same instinct that had my own shoulders tensed up around my ears every single time an authority figure spoke gently to me as a kid, waiting for the gentle voice to turn cold. I didn't rush him past that fear. I let him sit in it a moment, because sometimes the most honest thing you can give someone is the time to realize the blow isn't coming. I told him, and everyone gathering now in a loose, nervous circle around us, that this wasn't going to end with him unemployed by 5 o'clock. I told him it was going to end with an all-tenant meeting that evening, one that would change how this entire building operated from the ground up. And I told him, because I meant it, and because I needed him specifically to hear it, that people don't usually get invited to help rebuild the exact system that broke them. I was inviting him anyway. Derek didn't say much. I remember his throat working like he wanted to apologize right there in front of everyone. And I remember shaking my head slightly, just enough to let him know he didn't need to perform it for an audience. Some apologies are worth more when they're lived out in the months that follow, instead of spoken in the moment everyone's watching. What none of them knew yet, not Derek, not the boutique staff still whispering behind the glass, not even my own legal team fully, was that the meeting scheduled for that evening wasn't just going to announce a new policy. It was going to include a name on the new leadership roster that would make the entire mall go silent the second it was read aloud. Marlene's name. And somewhere in that room, once the meeting began, I was about to learn that Derek and Marlene already had a connection to each other that none of us, not me, not my lawyers, not even the two of them, had any idea existed. That evening, the atrium filled up the way I imagine a courtroom fills before a verdict. Nervous energy dressed in expensive fabric. Boutique owners clutching phones like they might need to call their own lawyers before the night was over. Sales associates huddled near the fountains, speaking in low voices. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Derek, standing a little apart from the rest, like a man who still wasn't sure whether he'd been forgiven, or was just waiting for the second shoe to drop. I stood in the center of that marble floor. This floor's hand had blocked me from crossing that morning. And I looked out at maybe 200 people who ran the daily life of a building they'd just found out belonged to me. I told them everything I'd told Derek, but slower this time, so it could land the way it needed to land. I told them about my mother and the coupon book. I told them about the box of cereal going back on the belt. I watched grown adults, people who managed 7-figure boutiques, go very still and very quiet, the way people do when a story seats somewhere they'd rather it hadn't. Then I told them about the policy. Every tenant, every lease renewal from that point forward would carry a binding clause. Dignity of service, applied equally, regardless of appearance, income signals, or perceived spending power. No more silent profiling at the door. No more hushed comments behind glass. The open door policy wasn't a suggestion. It was now a term of their contract, enforceable the same way a late rent payment was enforceable. I watched a few boutique owners exchange glances, doing the same math Marlene had done on the phone that morning. Was this going to cost them money? Was exclusivity part of their brand? Could they survive without the velvet rope? I told them plainly, if the $4,000 coat and the torn jacket don't get the same greeting at your door, you don't get to keep the lease. That's not negotiable. Some of you are about to find out that dignity was never actually bad for business. It just required you to stop mistaking coldness for class. And then I introduced the new head of guest experience for the entire Meridian Grand portfolio, Marlene Whitfield. I watched her walk out from the side hallway, professional, poised, the kind of calm that only comes from having steadied yourself in a mirror for 20 minutes beforehand. And I watched something happen in that atrium that I could not have written if I'd tried. Derek's whole body went rigid. His eyes locked onto her face the way you look at someone you thought you'd never see again. And Marlene stopped walking entirely, halfway across that marble floor, staring back at him with an expression that cracked straight through her professional composure. It turned out they knew each other. Not from that morning. From 19 years ago. Derek had been a teenager back then, working his very first job as a stock boy at the same grocery store where Marlene managed the front end. The same store where my mother put the cereal back on the belt. Derek remembered that day too. He'd been stacking cans 2 aisles over. He remembered a boy about his age standing at the register with his mother. Remembered the particular silence that fell over the front of the store. Remembered feeling sick about it even then and saying nothing. Because he was 17 and scared of losing a job that helped his own family's rent. He told us, voice unsteady, that he'd thought about that day more than once over the years. The tiger on the cereal box, a detail so small it had stayed lodged in him for 2 decades the exact same way it had stayed lodged in me. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it myself. Standing in that atrium with 200 people, watching 3 strangers realize they'd all been circling the same wound for 19 years without knowing it. Derek hadn't just repeated the sin of exclusion out of nowhere that morning. He'd learned it, the same way Marlene had been taught to enforce it. Standing 2 aisles away from the very moment that would go on to define my entire life. The wall he built at that boutique door wasn't original, it was inherited. Passed hand to hand, policy to policy, silence to silence, until it ended up in his mouth as 4 careless words to a stranger in sneakers. That's the moment the whole shape of this story's changed for me. Standing right there in real time. I'd walked back into that mall wanting to close a loop, wanting one clean, satisfying reckoning. Derek humbled, justice served, credits roll. What I got instead was something messier and, honestly, more true. I got to see, in the space of one evening, the entire mechanism by which cruelty gets manufactured and handed down, not because people are born cold, but because somebody trains them to be, and nobody ever circles back to retrain them into something warmer. Marlene had been that 17-year-old's boss. She'd modeled the behavior. He'd absorbed it as the cost of keeping a job. 20 years later, in a different building, wearing a different uniform, he did exactly what he'd watched be done. Because nobody had ever shown him another way to stand at a door. I made a decision in that moment I hadn't planned, and I'm telling you honestly, I didn't run it past legal first. I asked Marlene, in front of the entire room, whether she'd be willing to have Derek on her new team. Not as a security guard, not as an experienced ambassador trainee reporting to someone else, but specifically under her direct mentorship, the 2 of them rebuilding, together, the exact culture they'd once helped enforce without ever meaning real harm by it, or at least without ever being given the chance to mean anything else. Marlene didn't answer right away. I watched her look at Derek for a long moment. The 2 of them seeing each other clearly for maybe the first time in 19 years, and then she said something that I think is the actual emotional center of this whole story. More than anything I said myself. She said, I owe that debt more than you do. And Derek, eyes wet, said the words I think everyone in that room needed to hear out loud, the words I'd needed to hear my whole life without knowing it. Then let's pay it off together. That's what the open door policy actually became, in the weeks and months that followed. Not a corporate mandate handed down from a billionaire trying to feel good about himself, but an actual living repair job, carried out by 2 people who used to be the wall. Now retraining an entire building's culture from the inside. Every experienced ambassador who came through the new training program heard their story first, before they heard a single word about customer service scripts or de-escalation techniques. Marlene made sure of it. She said people don't change their behavior because a policy tells them to. They change it because someone finally makes the cost of that behavior real to them, in a story with a face attached. 3 months later, I got a call from the general manager, telling me a woman had come in that day, wearing a torn jacket, clearly not dressed for luxury shopping, clutching a small handwritten list, and Derek, now an ambassador, badge and everything, had walked straight up to her, not to check her out, but to check in on her, asked if she needed help finding anything, walked her personally to the counter, treated her like she was the only customer in the building. That woman was buying a graduation gift for her daughter. $41. She left in tears, the good kind, telling the staff it was the first time in her life a place like that had made her feel like she belonged, instead of like she was being tolerated. I didn't need to hear that story to know I'd made the right call, but I needed to hear it to understand something bigger, something I want to leave with you now, because this was never really a story about a mall, or a boutique, or even about me, or about Derek, or even really about Marlene. Dignity was never supposed to be a luxury item. It was never supposed to have a dress code, a price tag, or a set of approved shoes. Somewhere along the way, we built a world that lets exclusivity masquerade as excellence. A world where the smell of money became confused with the smell of worth, where a 17-year-old stock boy could absorb cruelty as a job requirement and carry it unexamined for 20 years, until it came out of his mouth at a glass door without him even fully choosing it. Most of us will never get the chance I got, the almost impossible, storybook chance to buy the building and rewrite the rules from the top down. Most of us don't get to walk back through those doors as the owner. But every single one of us gets to choose every day in far smaller rooms than a marble atrium, whether we're the person who looks at someone and decides they don't belong, or whether we're the door instead of the wall. And more than that, every one of us gets to choose whether we pass down what was done to us, or whether we're the one who finally breaks the chain, the way Derek and Marlene chose to, standing in that atrium, seeing each other clearly for the first time in 19 years. You don't need to own a mall to change the vibe of a room. You just need to remember, every time you're standing at the threshold with the power to let someone in or turn them away, that somewhere, some 11-year-old is holding someone's hand a little too tight, watching to see what kind of person you're going to be, and that the person standing across from you, the one who seems cold, who seems like the wall, might just be carrying a wound of their own that nobody ever thought to ask about. Be the one who opens the door, and when you can, be the one who teaches someone else how to open it too.